Hello. So in this video, I want to talk you through the defence of loss of control. It's a special defence that can only be used for murder, and that means a person will be guilty of voluntary manslaughter instead of murder. So, very first thing that you would write about is the definition. You would talk about the fact that it means voluntary manslaughter. It's where a person has committed the actus reus and the mens rea of murder, but they're arguing they did it because they lost their ability to control themselves. The victim did something which triggered them to make them snap, lose control and kill. So we caused the unlawful killing of a human being under the Queen's peace, and we did that with an intent to kill or cause serious harm, but because we snapped at something that the victim did. Now, this defence has been changed quite drastically by Section 54 of the Coroners and Justice Act 2009. And what that really means is that any case law from before 2009 is no longer good law. So if you're using very old textbooks that refer to some of the cases before the Act was passed, we shouldn't really be using reference to those in exam answers anymore. There is a little exception where you might want to talk about an essay question. So if it's not a scenario, if you're being asked to evaluate the defence of the loss of control, you may wish to talk a little bit about its history and why we felt the need to change provocation. So provocation is the old name for the same sort of defence, that you were provoked into killing. The victim did something that made you snap. What were the problems with that defence? I think we can categorise them into three. The first is the idea that there needed to be a very sudden and temporary response to the trigger. So someone did something and you snapped. You snapped very, very quickly, very, very suddenly, and it was over in a short amount of time. Now, it was said that this defence was used more successfully by men who stereotypically tend to lose their temper quickly. A lot of women, however, fell victim to this defence. They were unable to use it because a lot of women stereotypically tend to have more what we call slow burn reactions. They don't tend to trigger straight away due to something that the victim did. They store it, and they are maybe more likely to snap at something small. We saw this in the cases of Ahluwalia and Thornton, two women who were essentially abused emotionally and in some cases physically by their partners. Their partners did something which caused them to lose their control, and they killed their spouses. However, in both of those cases, they didn't meet the sudden and temporary loss of control guidance. If you remember in Ahluwalia, it was just something that was seen as relatively small. It wasn't seen as a serious enough provocation to cause a sudden and temporary loss of control. He threatened to take away the kids, which was small fry compared to all of the other abuse that he put her through. And she waited until later that evening to set him on fire. That doesn't suggest it was a very sudden or temporary reaction. In the case of Thornton, the wife went away and sharpened a knife before she went back to kill. And in this defence, they said that she'd had time to calm down so that when she went back to kill, it was planned. Now, both of those cases, it was a loss of control. They lost control of their senses, of their rationale, but the court said they were unable to do it. The definition was too wide. Sexual infidelity was a commonly used excuse for killing people, and yet again, often this was a defence used by men to justify killing their partners, and again, this was seen as unacceptable. Also, we had quite a confusing mix of statutory law and of common law as well, so judge-made law. So what Parliament decided to do was to clarify the rules, but they've changed it into loss of control. So this isn't like diminished responsibility, which was sharpened up by the Coroners and Justice Act, and therefore it's still okay to use any cases before 2009. This defence has been changed from provocation to loss of control, and therefore we need to start fresh with any laws or rules we have. Essentially, I think you can break loss of control or loss of self-control into 3 key questions. So you need to explain these rules for your AO1, you need to apply these rules in an AO2 scenario, and you also need to evaluate them if it's an AO3 essay. The first question, the first thing to consider by the jury, is whether the defendant actually lost control. Is that the reason that they killed? Did they snap? Did they lose their temper? It needs to be a little more than that though. It's the idea that we've actually lost control of our senses. And as rational human beings, if someone does something to upset us, our first reaction isn't or shouldn't be to kill them. As rational adults, we get angry, but we control ourselves. We control ourselves through logic. Essentially, loss of control is where we've lost those powers of reasoning. The powers of reasoning that say, stop, this isn't worth getting so mad over, or stop, you might want to kill them right now, but remember you'll go to prison, there'll be consequences to your actions. Where you snap, you lose that train of thought and the ability to think that way or to act in a certain way. You will also act obviously very, very out of character if you lose your control. There's not a whole lot of guidance because it is left to the jury to decide based on the individual facts and circumstances of each case if they lost control. But just a couple of pointers here on the right. If something is pre-planned, that definitely suggests that they haven't lost control of their senses. And this is why the case of Jewel failed. So he had argued that he'd lost control at the bullying of his co-worker and that's why he shot him. But actually there was evidence that he'd planned this. You know, he'd packed things in his car to go away. He'd left a note to ask his neighbour to look after his cat. Those aren't the actions of a person who is raging and lost control of themselves and can't be reasoned with. This is a person who's thought it through. That also suggests that although it doesn't have to be a sudden and temporary loss anymore, any time delay between the thing the victim did to annoy you or anger you and your reaction, any time delay between those is going to weaken your argument that you lost control. So while we're not saying it has to be sudden anymore and it has to be the straightaway reaction, the longer you leave it, the more likely that you have calmed down, thought it through, and then still decided to kill. What we're saying is we lost control. We lost control of that decision-making process. So if there is a time delay, that's going to weaken your argument. The next one is I think really the most important question, and I hope you can see this, I went a bit crazy with the coloured pens. But the next thing is what caused that loss of self-control? What triggered it? What did the victim do to trigger the reaction in the defendant? Now, there might be lots of things that trigger the defendant, but there are only 2 which are accepted by the courts since the reform of the law, and these are called qualifying triggers. So it's not enough that you were triggered, it has to be a qualifying trigger. And there is only 2 triggers that you can have that will be qualifying. Now, you might have had one or you might have had both, it doesn't matter. So the first is that the defendant feared serious violence. That's quite a high threshold. It's not enough to fear violence, it has to be a fear of serious violence. So just a couple of pointers there on the right hand side. It has to be a threat that has come from the victim. So the victim threatened serious violence and that's why you lost control and reacted the way you did. That threat has to be either to yourself or it can be to another, but it has to be a kind of specific or named individual. So for example, we saw in the case of R versus Ward that he'd feared serious violence to his brother. He lost control because of what the victim was threatening to do with his brother, because he was threatening to headbutt him. Now, headbutting someone is serious violence, And of course, it was to someone who was identified. So if you make a threat, or I'm going to go punch someone, that would not be enough. It wouldn't be serious enough, first off. And of course, it's not to a specific person. So for example, if someone threatened serious violence to your child, that could very much be one of the qualifying triggers. You could lose control because someone threatened to hurt your child. This tends to be quite straightforward, although remember, the courts won't allow it if you brought it on yourself. And we saw that in the case of R versus Dawes, where he started the argument by attacking the man who was having an affair with his wife. As my mum likes to say, you know, if you're going to start something, you can't finish it. It's the same thing. You can't start the violence and then say, oh, well, I feared a rebuttal from them. That won't work. Now, the other thing that could be a qualifying trigger, it's quite a mouthy sentence. So what I've tried to do is break it into different elements. So the other thing that could trigger you is either things that were said or things that were done, like actions. So things said or done of an extremely grave nature that caused a justifiable sense in the defendant of being seriously wronged. Quite a lot going on there. So things that were said or done that were very serious, okay? So similar to the fear of serious violence, the things that they say or do here must also be serious. So anything trivial is not going to pass the test straight away. It has to cause the defendant to feel seriously wronged. So they have to feel angry, upset, offended by that. And again, they have to feel seriously wronged that way. So it has to be a very, very, very serious insult, for example, that's left you feeling very, very, very offended. Then I would check if you think that's justifiable. And I've kind of put whether we would understand that. And this is really where the jury comes in and helps. So for example, someone may say something serious that leaves that person feeling really, really offended, but the rest of us would go, is that really bad? So for example, in the case of Hatter, the man's girlfriend had been seeing someone else and he felt very, very offended by this, and he broke into her house and killed her. Now, he felt seriously wronged by this, clearly. He was very, very upset and offended about what this woman had been doing. She kind of used him for his money as well. Is it really serious? Seeing someone else? It's not very nice, but in the grand scheme of things, is it extremely grave? And also, would we agree it's justifiable that he felt so upset? It has to meet all of the criteria, and that's what the 12 members of the jury will be deciding. Is what the victim did really, really serious? Did the defendant actually feel serious about this? And finally, do we understand all of that? One of the sort of key things has been around infidelity. It was made very, very clear that this was a problem of the old law, that people would use evidence of cheating as a defence for killing. And it was made very clear in the Coroners and Justice Act, it specifically says that infidelity is not enough. However, in the case of Clinton, he was able to use infidelity as part of his defence. And I think that's the key here. So it wasn't the only thing said or done, but it was part of what was said or done. There was other things as well. So in Clinton, his wife has been cheating on him, but she also taunted him about this. She taunted him about how these other men were so much better than him and how she was going to take away the children, and she mocked him because he tried to commit suicide. And that package of things said or done were very serious, and they left him feeling seriously wronged and upset. And I think most of us would agree that seems justifiable. If you've been cheated on and taunted and threatened to have your kids taken away, that whole thing would seem really, really terrible. So infidelity could be part of the things said or done, but there must be others as well. So that's something, again, the jury is going to have to take into account. But sexual infidelity is not enough. And the idea that the jury is reviewing this links into the final part here. It's not just enough that you lost control because of one of those reasons. It's not enough that you lost control because they threatened you, or it's not enough that you lost control because they said or did something really, really bad. It has to cause the same sort of reaction in someone else. So I suppose this is why we have the jury. Would a reasonable person have lost control as well in the same way? So the reasonable man test, essentially. So what do we mean by a reasonable person? A person of normal tolerance and self-restraint. Now, I have no restraint. You know, sometimes I'll really, really say what I think. And also I have a terrible temper. I'm very impatient. I'm very short-tempered. The jury would not take that into account, that Anna is normally very short-tempered. Therefore, it's not surprising she got angry really quickly. What they would do is they would ask, would an ordinary person of sort of quite normal patience, would they react the same way Anna did, for example? Also, when we say reasonable person, we're talking of someone of the same sex and age. So the same sex is going back to what I talked about at the start. It's recognizing that perhaps men and women will react in different ways to different things. So men will be compared to other men, maybe quick to lose their temper. Women will be compared to other women who might have more of a slow burn reaction. It also looks at age. So for example, if you're younger, you might be quicker to lose your temper and not have the same level of self-restraint as an adult. So all of those will be taken into account. And would they have had the same reaction in those same circumstances? So for example, if you're drunk, we're not going to take that into account. But if you, for example, have a mental condition, although it might be easier to go through and argue diminished responsibility, you know, we would take that into account. So if you are taunting someone who is suffering from depression, they might react in a different way to someone who isn't suffering from depression, for example. All of those questions have to come together to explain the killer's actions. So I committed the murder because I lost control due to either fearing serious violence, or they said something really serious that really, really left me feeling wronged and upset and done badly to, and anyone would understand. And anyone else would react the same way, you know, and that's what the jury is really, really thinking, really comparing that reaction. What could you imagine others doing the same? Because if you can imagine others doing the same, it's probably understandable. And I think that's what we're trying to achieve here. Do we understand the reason why the person did what they did? And therefore that's why we see it as less serious than murder. And that's why it might justify a lesser sentence than mandatory life. I hope that makes sense. Thank you for listening.